Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to PD Active's Ask the Experts online roundtable. My name is Todd Morrish, and I will be your host and moderator this afternoon, and I'm joined by Sue Stein-Black and Mary Hahn, also on the events committee for PD Active, helping me today. Before I introduce our panelists this afternoon, a little bit of housekeeping. First, my usual plug for PD Active programs. Aside from our well-known support groups, including groups for young onset and children of parents with PD, among others, PD Active also offers many other classes and programs for people with Parkinson's and those supporting them. There's Tai Chi and yoga and Pilates and meditation. There's also voice and singing and boxing and dance. So PD Active has embraced this new model of digital program delivery, and we've made it easy for our members to access these great classes, and they're really very affordable also. We're hoping to get more participants into these programs to continue to make it worthwhile for our instructors. So please check out the calendar link on the homepage of our all new pdactive.org website. You'll need to scroll down a little bit below the fold. And do spread the word, please. Now for this event. You are all, or at least most of you, currently on mute. Once our panelists have been introduced, we will take all attendees off mute to enable a free-flowing conversation sparked by Q&A with our panelists. If you prefer to mute yourself, that's perfectly fine. Just unmute yourself to raise questions or comments, or submit those via the Zoom chat feature, which you will find in the tool tray at the bottom of your Zoom window, and which we will demonstrate for you momentarily. If the conversation becomes a little too lively, shall we say, and difficult to hear or understand, we may fall back to muting all attendees and encourage you then to submit questions either through Zoom chat feature or by literally raising your hand so that we may unmute you for you to ask your question. And we will do our best to get all questions answered. Also, by the way, if you find yourselves with a lot of background noise and you're not muted, please take it upon yourself to mute yourself if you would. Important, I mentioned this a moment ago, but this session is being recorded and it will be posted on the PD Active YouTube channel in the next few days. And we thank our panelists for their willingness to record the session. Finally, PD Active depends on donations to bring programs and events like this to our members free of charge. And we certainly remain grateful for your contributions. If you have not yet had a chance to make the suggested registration donation of $10 for this roundtable, we will paste that link into the chat feature now. Let me do that for you. This should go to everyone. So that's how you can see how your chat feature works if you're not familiar with it. There's also a green donate button in the upper right-hand corner of the PD Active homepage, always and forever there. So go there as often as you can, please. Today's session is titled, What to Know About the Legal and Some Insurance Issues Surrounding PD. Needless to say, this can be a complex and prickly topic. Fortunately, we are joined today by two very qualified panelists to help us navigate these complexities. And so now, without further delay, PD Active is pleased to introduce to you our panelists for today's roundtable, Deborah England and Brandy Senziak. Ms. England is an attorney practicing in California state and federal courts. She has been in practice in San Francisco for over 30 years, representing employees in discrimination, harassment, whistleblowing, wage and hour, and contract litigation. Ms. England has authored or co-authored several books, including The Essential Guide to Family and Medical Leave, published by Nolo in 2018. Her specialties include employment law, civil rights, personnel practices, diversity training, contract negotiation, and dispute resolution. Wow, that's a mouthful. Ms. Senziak received her BA from the University of California at Santa Cruz in 2005, and her JD from John F. Kennedy University School of Law in 2009. In 2018, Brandy joined ILRCSF, which stands for Independent Living Resource Center of San Francisco, where she supervises that organization's legal services program. Brandy is passionate about advocating for underserved and marginalized individuals and educating people about their rights. Welcome to you both, and thank you for joining us today. So these intros are very abbreviated and hardly do you both justice. So please take a few moments to tell us more about the work you do and how that pertains to folks with PD. Brandy, we'll start with you, then Deborah, then we'll unmute folks and open it up for discussion and questions. And let me start by at least unmuting you both. How about that for a nice start? In fact, you can probably do that, Deborah and Brandy. Brandy, I see you joined. Thank you. So Brandy, why don't you start, introduce yourself and tell us how the work you're doing pertains to those with PD.
Hi, yes. So I, as you know, I supervise the legal program at Independent Living Resource Center, San Francisco, and our legal program there is pretty small. It's myself along with an intern. And we do different areas of law. Primarily, we focus on Social Security, which is, their state Social Security, but we actually usually focus on federal Social Security, SSI or SSDI. So we help people apply for disability benefits when they become too disabled to work. We also request reasonable accommodations for individuals, sometimes in the workplace or school or apartments where they live. And we also work with some pre-eviction stuff. So like if someone's having a dispute with the landlord, we don't do eviction cases, but we do negotiate with landlords. And then we've been doing a lot of stuff around COVID. The crisis care policies, we worked really hard to get those so that they didn't discriminate against people with disabilities. And we also have done a lot of work around the vaccine, and we're a big part with us and a couple other legal organizations like Disability Rights California, DREDF, and Justice and Aging, in making it so that people with certain medical conditions and certain disabilities would be able to get the vaccine as of last, March 15th. So yeah, that's sort of what we do for the most part.
Great, that's a good backgrounder. Deborah, fill us in on exactly what work you do other than all those great specialties I listed.
Well, primarily I focus on employment law and represent employees in all kinds of claims, but specifically discrimination, including disability discrimination and denial of medical leave, retaliation for taking leave, etc. And how this, I think, meshes with your organization, Todd, and everyone here, is that, some of you may be employees and have questions in that particular sector, but also that kind of leave, family medical leave, covers many people in a family. In California, it includes siblings, as well as parents, children, including adopted and foster children, and spouses or partners of any particular type. So that's, I think, what I have to offer here today, particularly.
Great. Good. Well, I know I've already fielded in advance a couple of questions from Frank and from Donato. So I will lob those out there in a minute, but I wanted to see if anybody right off the bat, this is all going to be fueled and charged by your questions, and it's fine that those questions then blossom into full-blown discussions. And if anybody has feedback on somebody else's questions or experiences, we encourage that. So please let fly with any questions you have now. Let's see, I'm finding that I'm not really able to unmute all unless, so I will let you unmute yourselves and lob out any questions. Anybody want to start the ball rolling?
I'd be happy to, if you'd like me to.
Good, Frank.
Okay, just to give you a position, a little bit about what I want to talk about, and that is clinical trials. And in particular, what kind of coverage you have in the event that there is a bad outcome in your clinical trial. Now, I participated in the nilotinib trial and learned some things. Unfortunately, or I should say, fortunately, did not have any bad outcomes in my trial. However, while I was in the trial, I met a person called Jean Burns, and she is a person who has Parkinson's who went through a clinical trial on the GDNF trial. The issue that I'm raising and would like to put on the table here is the issue of what happens as far as what happens legally to you in the event that there is a bad outcome from a trial. Now, most people going into trials expect two things to happen. Number one, nothing, and number two, it's beneficial. But it is possible, and especially in the kinds of trials that we're getting involved with now, with like the GDNF trial, where they're actually doing some plumbing in your brain and putting things directly into your brain over a period of time, the opportunity for infection or stroke is there. So it's a very real thing. Now, the way the system works for the United States is that you sign a consent agreement, and then that consent agreement is a statement on behalf of the research institution offering you 30 days of medical coverage in the event of a bad outcome. Well, this is hardly adequate in the event that you are laid out in long-term care for the rest of your life. And there's some real moral and ethical issues here. And I just wanted to point that out, that I don't think that people are aware or think about that aspect of our current situation as far as clinical trials are concerned. But I gather there have been 1 or 2 presidential commissions to study this issue, and they have not resolved it. I haven't dealt with this in depth, but I did take a good look at the consent agreement I signed for the nilotinib trial, which was done both at Georgetown University. I got a consent agreement there, and I also got one from the Fox organization's version of the same trial that they ran at a parallel time. I also have a very interesting interview at NIH, which involved medical students and an annual inquiry into bioethical considerations. And they had Gene Burns interviewed with a philosopher, and then they interviewed a fellow named Feinberg, who was the man who negotiated in 9/11 the BP problem in the Gulf, as well as the Boston Marathon thing. And he basically, it's very, very interesting interview. And he skipped right over the issues, merrily over the issues of the moral and ethical aspects, and went straight to the pragmatic, where's the money coming from kind of approach. But I think the United States is one of the few countries in the world that does not provide coverage for bad outcomes. And it's my position that it should be considered as a business matter, where you buy insurance when you run a clinical trial, and that covers this kind of coverage. Mm-hmm. It's extremely unreasonable that in the event of a bad outcome, that you get 30 days of coverage, and then you've got to sue and go through that whole process at a time when you're in a rather weak position to get compensation for your coverage for your medical expenses.
So there might be 2 parts to your question, I guess, Frank, if I can summarize for the panelists. One is, if you find yourself post program 30 days beyond, and you find yourselves with a bad outcome, what are your legal tools available to you after the fact, right? You mentioned
well, the legal tools available is to simply sue for right. Coverage. But the point is, you have to go through this whole process. And at a point, I mean, it just is unethical in my mind that we don't have this kind of coverage in the United States.
Right. And then I guess the other question for the panelists might be, do they know of any work being done out there to try to hold these groups that are running these tests accountable for better documentation and better support and better coverage? So I'm not sure if this is anything you've ever covered, Deborah or Brandy, but let's throw that out to you and see if you have waded in these waters before.
No, that's outside my area of expertise entirely, but it sounds like the consent form covers it, and I would tend to agree with Frank that probably this is an issue as a policy matter that needs to change, as opposed to anything that an individual can do with respect to their particular agreement.
Well, what an individual can do, of course, is to insist that this consent agreement be a change for them to participate in the trial.
Right.
But let me tell you, from my perspective, and I think of many people's perspective, is that they're damn anxious to be in the trial, and they're inclined to just
sign anything.
yeah, you're not, it's not a good position to be in. But I think that it should be made more aware publicly to people who have Parkinson's and thinking about going into a clinical trial, that they raise this issue.
Right. So if nothing else, let this be a warning to the 25 or so of us here today that if you are interested in a trial, make sure you read all that documentation and that legal documentation up front thoroughly, maybe get it vetted by an attorney.
Yes,
If you're not comfortable with any of it, definitely get it vetted by an attorney
definitely,
or
definitely.
stay away, right?
Yeah.
Brandy, any additional feedback you wanted to supply on this topic? Is this also out of your bailiwick?
It's definitely out of my legal scope of what I do. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
If
Well,
I would just add to this, that if anybody at some point wants to get the materials together to build a case for this and generate some interest, I mean, I have all the documentation of consent agreements. I have the interview with NIH and Feinberg and all of that. So I think that if someone were to put this whole thing together and get interested in it, I'd certainly be able to provide them all the research.
good. Okay, duly noted. Thank you, Frank.
You bet.
Frank's was one of the questions that came in early, so that takes one of them off my list. Anybody on the group right now have any other questions you'd like to lob out now? Good. I see a question from Barbara, but let me redirect for just a second. I'm going to field Donato's question, which came into me on by email earlier. And it behooves me to sort of give a little bit of a backgrounder, and I'll use my own personal story as context that so that people are aware of the flow of sort of what you generally sign up for when you are. In my case, I was employed when I was diagnosed with PD. So I won't give you the whole gory details, but so the first thing to do is to look for accommodations that they will try to help you if they've got good HR and they mean it. They will try to help you with accommodations, which can run the gamut of, speak to type software, better ergonomics at your workstation, things like that. So they help in that regard. Then the insurance will try to get you, and this is group coverage. So group coverage through an employee is different from private coverage. So understand that. So I got short-term disability, or STD, through my let me allow somebody else in here, through my employer's group coverage. That after a certain number of months needs to transition into long-term disability. I don't remember exactly what those months are. Maybe Deborah, you can answer that in a second. So then I had to jump through the hoops of getting a long-term disability claim with a group carrier, and they were very, very reluctant to want to do that. In fact, they rejected me early on, and I had to appeal, and I finally got my claim granted. So with that as a context, I'm going to bounce over here and read Donato's case, and this may fall into your window, Deborah. Donato wants to know if he can apply for LTD, I abbreviate that, that's long-term disability, retroactively through the group carrier of an employer he was working for back when he first noticed his initial PD symptoms. In other words, he was working as an electrical engineer for a big tech company in Silicon Valley. He started experiencing his first PD symptoms. He went to see a neurologist who said it could be PD. He basically went into denial, admittedly, left that company and moved to Italy with his family. By 2018, the symptoms had become so pronounced that he went to see multiple neurologists in Italy who eventually confirmed the PD diagnosis. In April of 2019, Donato moved back to SF, and in September of 2019, he got a formal PD diagnosis from his current UCSF neurologist. Question, is it too late now to go back to that employer and apply for a short-term and or long-term disability from that original employer and their group carrier?
So the short answer is yes, probably.
Great.
It's probably too late, yes.
Yes, it's too late, or yes, he could go back and apply.
Yes, I think it is too late. Randy, do you have anything to add on that? It's more in your bailiwick with respect to the insurance aspect.
Yeah, I don't do long-term disability as far as like the private policies, like Lincoln or different companies have those private policies. I can tell you with Social Security, they look at basically what you can prove medically. So if you can go back and prove in your records that you were disabled, 3 years ago, they may set that as the date you became disabled. But if you were still working, even if it was for another company and you were making more than what they call SGA, which is, it goes up every year. Currently, it's around $1,100 a month. If you're making more than that, then they would say that you weren't too disabled to work because you were still making at least SGA.
Does that make sense, Donato? Did I capture your scenario correctly?
Yeah, you did perfectly. Deborah, you said probably. If I want to know for sure, I mean, I have the benefit manual and the long-term disability booklet from my company, but
All right. I would suggest that you speak with an attorney who specializes in disability benefits specifically, because
Yeah, I
it's a
would talk to
tricky
someone.
question.
Agreed.
Good.
I would speak to somebody who deals with long-term disability, like for like the insurance company, like the insurance companies, because those attorneys are different sometimes than like, I have relationships with people that have long-term disability experience, and they don't actually usually do Social Security. So they're a lot of times different attorneys.
okay. I did try to contact the BART Association of San Francisco for a referral, but they didn't find any lawyer who would want to talk with me. I don't know if it was because they are too busy, or maybe because they didn't think there was a case.
I have a referral. Let me see if I can put it in the chat.
Okay, thanks, Brandy.
Good.
Yeah, and while you're doing that, Brandy, let me also mention that you can contact the Bar Association of any county in California. I'm assuming that's where you live.
Yeah,
Every county has a lawyer referral service, just like the Bar Association in San Francisco. Same,
right?
it's administered the same way. So it's a nonprofit public service, and they screen the attorneys. So I would just try, every county in your area, first of all, and then whatever Brandy has to offer, which might be more targeted in terms of a referral source.
thank
That's
you.
good. That's good. You got that, Donato?
Yeah, perfect.
Good.
Thank you.
Great. I neglected to mention in sort of the evolution of somebody's PD experience through work that one of those steps along the way is getting some coverage through the Family Medical Leave Act, and that's something Deborah specializes in, and that's a question Barbara has for Deborah. You mentioned that siblings were part of the Family Leave Act. Could you provide more details on how this works, how much time they can get, etc.?
Yeah, so everyone gets the same amount of time essentially, and it's limited. I mean, it's not very much. Let me pull up the exact number of weeks. It's a very specific number of weeks of leave. But the point is that an employee can take off the specified amount of time to care for a sibling who has a medical condition, a serious medical condition, which is defined very broadly in California and fairly broadly as well in federally by the federal law as well. So let me just get you that. I should know this off the top of my head. Right?
Barbara, while she's looking that up, did you mean for the sake of you getting time off to care for a sibling or spouse with PD? Is that sort of the context of your question, or maybe you care not to answer?
No, I was thinking more in terms of my brother or sister getting time off if I needed something.
Yes, yes. In California, absolutely. That I think, that's not necessarily the case in other states, but definitely here.
Or is your brother in California, Barbara?
Yes.
Good.
Perfect.
But I mean, is the employer mandated to provide that, or how does that work if the
Yes.
employer says they can't afford to let the person leave? Or
That's a great question. So unless they can show, the employer can show that it will produce an undue hardship, which is a very high standard, they have to allow the employee to take the leave if they're otherwise qualified for the leave. They have to have worked for the employer for a year essentially, and the employer has to have at least 5 employees. So
Okay.
that's a pretty low bar. And then they get 12 weeks. That's the amount of time in total that they can take, and they can take it either all together or intermittently, including hours in a particular day.
Got it. Thank you so much.
Good. Good. Just to go back for a second, Donato, do you see what Brandy was able to paste into the chat?
Yeah, I just got it. Thank you,
Good.
Brandy.
Okay.
I just was
And
making
anyone
notes.
else interested? Karen mentions in the chat window that she has a question since we're on the topic of FMLA. She also has a question on FMLA. Karen, unmute yourself.
Hi. I was actually asking, my brother was just diagnosed with a later stage of PD, and he lives in Wisconsin. I work here in California, so I approached my employer and asked if I could work remotely in Wisconsin just for a short term, and I don't think they were as receptive. So apparently I am covered by FMLA. Can I, does the California law apply to a sibling in another state?
I believe so, because the important point is that you work in California. So
Yes.
the law, and by the way, the law we're talking about in particular is called the California Family Rights Act. It's
Okay.
essentially the same as FMLA, but a little better, you know, a little broader in what it offers to employees. And since you work here, I believe you're entitled to the leave. That's the question, is like, are you eligible to take the leave? Is the, you know, have you worked there, you know, the right amount of time? And if so, then I don't think there's a restriction because your brother is elsewhere. No.
And then I take it the leave is unpaid.
That's correct.
And does the employer have to keep your job open at
Yes.
the end? Okay.
Yes. Again, unless there's an undue hardship imposed, but that's a very high bar. And the only other exception is if there is some reason that the business closes or the particular department you work in is eliminated while you're on the leave. If it's a legitimate elimination, they don't have to offer you a job back under those circumstances, but it has to be something that happens regardless of your taking the leave.
And Deborah,
And what is the best way to approach an employer?
In writing. So what you want to do is you want to put in writing to HR in particular that you need accommodation for a relative under the CFRA, which is the California Family Rights Act, to care for a relative who has a serious medical condition. And you want to know how to do that. And they should have forms in place for you to fill out so that you can start that process.
Thank you so much.
And Deborah, have you found how many weeks the FMLA allows off?
Yeah, 12 weeks, as I mentioned a moment ago.
That's right. And none of that paid, but
Doesn't have to be. If, however, I'm glad you brought that up. If the employer has a paid leave policy, then they have to abide by that policy. So in other words, just because you call it family medical leave and they say, well, that's unpaid leave. If they have a paid leave policy, they have to pay you under their policy.
Right, which might be translated as vacation time. So if you are needing time off, you could take your vacation time first and then FMLA after that.
True.
I mean, some companies enforce that you first take your paid time off for?
Yes, companies have a variety of approaches to this. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. Any other questions by the group? Come on, really? Can I get a show of hands of anybody who has tried to go back? So let's start with who's still fully employed, full-time. Show of hands. John? Not me, I'm actually not. Frank, Vickers? Okay, and Christopher. And how about part-time? Anybody? Okay, those that had their hands up, have you tried to work with your employer on paid versus FMLA time off and accommodations? Two different things, very much so, but yeah, Scott, how'd that experience go for you, Scott? Are you still in the throes of it?
I'm actually coming up against the end date of my original prospective estimate of how long I'd be out. And I've had recent conversations with the managing partner of my firm. It basically said, I set the time. And so basically I'm working with doctors to say, you know, what does that look like? 2 hours a day, maybe, you know, just something, just kind of, and take it from there and not take it any further than will trigger the symptoms.
That's pretty great. Would you say that's a
Yeah.
pretty generous employer, Deborah?
I certainly would.
Good for you, Scott. Congrats. Is anybody else? Yeah, Christopher,
Yes, I have a related question.
go ahead.
And that's because I'm at an early stage. I haven't disclosed my condition to my employer yet. And so the question comes is, what's the correct time to do that?
Well, if you're asking from a legal standpoint, the correct time to do it is when you think you're going to start needing some sort of either leave or accommodation on the job.
Okay.
But I would sort of plan ahead a little bit so that, you know, if you're feeling like, whoa, you know, in a couple months, I'm definitely going to need an
Right.
ergonomic desk or whatever. You want to get the process rolling so you'll have it in place when you truly need it.
Yeah, and part of course is predicated in the fact that since everybody's working at home, my contact with my employer is kind of limited right now. So I'm thinking about what strategies I should adopt. And one of the reasons I'm here is, you know, to find what's the opportune time for me to get into that conversation with them, especially as we should be returning to work in the next few months.
Right. Right.
And I would
Yeah,
also
I mean,
reiterate,
that's-
make
oh,
sure
sorry.
like to always do it in writing.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Including email, by the way. Email is a perfectly valid written form. But maintain, you know, keep a copy on your own personal device.
Mhm.
Okay.
Good question. Always a little bit dicey not knowing when to approach an employer. And I think what we'll find out there, correct me if I'm wrong, Deborah, is that there are lots of different positions that employers take. I mean, whether they're abundantly helpful and assistive, or if they're, you know, reluctant and just want to stick to the rules and get you out of there.
Yeah, and one thing I would suggest also, by the way, in response to your question, is to take a look now while you have some time at all the policies of the organization that you work for, so that you know what they expect you to do in terms of their leave policies, so that you make sure you jump through whatever those hoops are. And then also that you right now start kind of working with your healthcare providers so that they have a heads up that you're going to need to have them kind of let you know, how many hours, if there's an hours limitation coming on me, if I need to start thinking about that or other types of accommodations.
Has anyone moved farther down the food chain to short-term disability? Scott also? Anyone else? No? Anybody past that into long-term disability? Adam, Scott? Okay. Any experiences to share in those capacities? Was that pretty seamless for you, Scott? Were they as helpful there as they were with your accommodations?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about the fact that there was a day coming when I'd basically say, this is it. And so kind of laid out general expectations, and I raised my hand and I said, this is it.
Yeah.
And then started working on doing additional documentation and talking about kind of with the length of time we were talking about, which was 5 months.
Mm-hmm.
We were going with, you should maximize the state long-term, short-term disability, apply for the long-term, have this kick in. So they actually,
Wow, they were helpful.
they between HR and the partners of the firm, I'm a partner too. So, it's some of these things are anticipated maybe to be happening later in life and in career. They jumped through hoops and they said, it's all about you. That's what they said to me.
Great.
Great.
It's good.
That's fortunate. Yeah, we could all get such good coverage. And I could also tell you that from experience, it's very helpful to document everything. So I've been keeping firm,
Crucial.
documentation on both my private coverage and my group coverage, and my SSDI, because once you sign up for long-term disability, some of you might be able to relate to this, that carrier will eventually insist that you also get SSDI, right, Brandy? Because then they're going to take what they're paying you on a monthly basis and deduct what SSDI is paying you so that they can pay less. They prefer
Yes, once you get approved, they're going to want you to get SSDI you apply for SSDI and you get denied, they're going to want you to appeal it until you've basically exhausted all of your appeals. Sometimes it is harder to get SSDI than some, private insurance plans. But also I've heard the opposite, that, like sometimes it's easier to keep SSDI than it is to keep like private insurance. I've heard tricky things that private insurance companies do. Like, for example, I don't practice this type of law, but from personal experience, I know that like if you leave a company and you get, let go because maybe your FMLA is done and you're going to be disabled, if you sign like a severance agreement, then a lot of times in severance agreements, you're giving up all rights to sue, even some under ERISA. And if you do that, then like most like the long-term disability plans and short-term disability plans that are offered by employers, that these private insurance companies, are under ERISA law. So in some cases, like people get into a lot of trouble because they end up by giving up their rights. If like the disability plan comes back and says, oh, we don't think you're disabled any longer, then you've given up your rights to sue for that, basically. So I think that, I feel like these private companies like are a little bit trickier almost than SSI and SSDI.
In what sense?
Because like, for example, if you have a severance agreement and you're getting SSDI, SSDI is not, Social Security doesn't care that you got a severance package. Under SSI, they may care if your severance was more than $2,000 and, but typically if you have been working for at least 10 years and you're getting SSDI, it doesn't matter that you signed a severance agreement. They may review your case to make sure you're still disabled, but they're not going to ask you, they're not going to try to kick you off of benefits because you gave up your rights, because it's like not under ERISA law, basically.
Help us understand what ERISA law is.
So it's federal law. It's employment. I'm not an ERISA attorney. There's specific ERISA attorneys. Usually the attorney that I gave you, like put in the chat, the contact for, she practices ERISA law. And it's like a different area of law, but it basically covers benefits that you get from your employer.
Would you say before anyone should discuss severance with their employer, they should check it out with an attorney?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Always,
You should
always.
review that agreement with an attorney. Make sure you're not giving up any rights, to long-term disability or any other benefits that you may be getting.
I think that's important because I think on the face of it, these severance deals just look and sound attractive because it's a chunk of money that they'll send you out the door with, but you may not know what you're giving up in receipt of that.
Yeah, and always keep in mind, they're lawyered up, and you absolutely should have a lawyer take a look at any document you sign that gives up rights of any kind.
Yeah, good. Karen chats that she's got another question on FMLA. Fire away, Karen.
Thank you. The situation with my brother is a bit tricky, and I've only had 3 weeks to absorb it. Fortunately, I have a sister that's located close by and we're coordinating. But one of the tricky things is that our brother is overwhelmed and isn't able to clearly answer whether he himself is on FMLA or short-term disability or long-term disability. And his neurologist says that he will not be able to go back to work. So I don't know how to unravel that problem.
Well, I can tell you with respect to FMLA, if he cannot work, then then FMLA is over for him, basically, because the whole point of FMLA is to provide a period of leave for somebody who's returning to work. It's a protection of the job for the most part, as well as, there's some other aspects to it, but that's the main thing. So if he is for sure not going to be able to return to work, then he's outside the scope of the FMLA.
I don't think he's communicated with his employer at all.
But do they know he's been diagnosed, Karen?
He worked as a supervisor in a food processing factory, and he fell and was taken to the hospital. And you know, and he's still going through a final diagnosis. So his employer is the one who made sure he went to the hospital.
I mean, there may be some workers' comp stuff going on too, it sounds like, if he fell at work.
For sure. But are you saying that the doctors are looking at this fall as whether or not they would consider it under workers' comp? They're also saying that it may be a precursor to Parkinson's, and that might be the diagnosis.
Yeah, I think they are pretty sure it's in the Parkinson's family, but I don't know what his coverage is. I have no idea what his employer is providing him. I'm winging in the dark, and because he's mentioned FMLA, but he's a bit overwhelmed. He's very overwhelmed and a bit confused. So I'm uncomfortable approaching his employer. I don't feel I have the legal right to do it. And I don't want to impact anything that he's currently has. So I don't know how to.
I mean, one idea could be you could talk to your brother and say, hey, I would ask him, do you want me to help you figure this out? And if he does, then you can say, well, have you gotten anything from your employer? Can I see what documents they've sent you? Or have you signed anything? You could ask him to see the stuff if he wants your help. If he doesn't want your help, then I think that's a different story. But, you know, he might be able to share documents with you.
I would also suggest, I think it's wise not to contact the employer first off, yourself at this point, but I would suggest you contact a lawyer in the state where he lives to get some idea of what the protections are in the state, as well as, they'll be familiar with the federal law if it's an employment lawyer in the state that he lives in. And a good organization for that purpose is the National Employment Lawyers Association. They have a referral service too, I believe.
Thank you.
National Employment Lawyers Association.
Yes.
Okay, that's good. Good resource. Can't type, so this is taking forever. Great.
Beautiful.
What I would like to do, we're about 10 minutes to the hour.